My dad said, "We look out for family." Then he tried to pressure me into giving my house to my brother because he needed it for the baby. So I looked him in the eye and said, "You don't get to demand what you never helped me earn." The worst part was that he acted like I was being difficult for no reason, not like I was refusing to help a stranger, not like I was refusing to lend money for a car repair or cover a bill for a month. He wanted me to hand over the house I had spent years working toward, and he made it sound like I was the selfish one for not doing it. For context, I bought the house when I was 31. It was a small 3-bedroom ranch in a quiet part of the Columbus suburbs, nothing fancy, just a solid place with a little yard, an old detached garage, and a kitchen that had probably last been updated when George W. Bush was still in office. I loved it anyway. It was the first thing in my life that felt like it was truly mine. I had spent most of my 20s bouncing between apartment leases, helping other people move, and telling myself that one day I would stop paying rent into a black hole. I worked overtime whenever I could get it. I took on side jobs on weekends. I skipped vacations. I drove the same used truck until it started making noises I ignored out of pure financial denial. The down payment came from years of that. Nobody in my family helped. Not my dad. Not my mom. Not my younger brother, Eric. They all acted proud of me after I closed, but pride is cheap when it costs nothing. That was the thing I kept forgetting until this whole mess happened. My family liked the idea of my success more than the work behind it. Eric had always been the one who needed something. Money for rent, money for tires, money for a security deposit, money because he was between jobs, money because he was behind on something and needed a reset. My parents never seemed to mind helping him. They called it getting him back on his feet. I called it a pattern. He was 28 when this happened, and his girlfriend, Megan, was pregnant with their first kid. That pregnancy changed the way everybody treated him. Suddenly, every bad decision looked like a crisis instead of a choice. Suddenly, every request sounded urgent. Suddenly, my dad acted like the whole family had to reorganize itself around Eric's situation. It started with a Sunday dinner at my parents' house in Reynoldsburg. I remember because I had just spent half the day cleaning gutters and the other half pulling weeds in my yard, and I was tired enough to be irritated before I even walked through the front door. My mom had made pot roast. My dad had set out beer for everybody and iced tea for my mom and me because he had decided years ago that I was the only one who never wanted a drink with dinner, which was not actually true. I just usually drove myself. Eric and Megan were already there when I got there. Megan looked uncomfortable in the way people do when they know they are about to be part of something they did not start. Eric looked nervous too, but with him that usually meant he wanted something and knew it might not go smoothly. My dad was in the kind of mood that felt rehearsed. He kept clearing his throat. He kept glancing at me. He kept talking about family like it was an ingredient he had just discovered. I should have seen it coming then. I did not. We ate for a while with all the usual nonsense about work, traffic, weather, and one of my dad's old stories about his first truck. Then he started steering the conversation toward Eric's apartment. He said the place was getting too expensive. He said the baby would need stability. He said rent would only get worse. He said he did not like the idea of a newborn in a place with thin walls and bad neighbors. At first, I thought he was just leading into a request for money. That would have annoyed me, but it would have been familiar. I could have said maybe I could help with a deposit or a few months of rent if Eric found a safer place. That was more or less my default position with him. Help, but not endlessly. Then my dad made it about my house. He said Eric needed a real home. He said families should make room when a baby was coming. He said it was the kind of moment that showed who people really were. I asked him, as calmly as I could, what exactly he meant by that. He did not answer directly. He said the house would be perfect for Eric and Megan. He said it had the extra bedroom. He said the neighborhood was better for a child. He said I could always get another place because I did not have a wife or kids. That was the first time I felt the full weight of what they were asking. Not to stay there temporarily. Not to babysit. Not to let them crash for a few months. He wanted me to sign the house over. At first, I honestly thought I had misunderstood him. I remember looking at him, then at Eric, then at Megan, and waiting for somebody to correct the part of the conversation that made no sense. Nobody did. My dad said it like it was obvious. He wanted me to put the house in Eric's name so Eric could have a stable start. He said I could move into an apartment for a while and save money again. He said this was what family did when somebody was about to have a baby. The silence after that was awful. Megan stared at her plate. Eric would not meet my eyes. My mom looked like she wanted the floor to split open and swallow the whole table. I remember feeling embarrassed, mostly because for a second I thought maybe I was the crazy one. Maybe there was some hidden family rule I had missed. Maybe people actually did give away houses for grandbabies, and I was the only one who thought this sounded insane. Then I remembered the mortgage statement sitting in my filing cabinet at home. I remembered the property tax bill. I remembered every Saturday I spent painting trim and every Sunday I spent mowing the lawn. Nobody at that table had helped me earn any of it. My dad had not even helped me move. I told him no, not loudly, not dramatically, just no. I said I was not signing over my house. I said I would help Eric find a place. I said I could help with deposits if he needed it. I said I was not giving away something I had spent years paying for just because he and Megan were having a baby. My dad did not take that well. He told me I was making a baby pay for adult pride. He told me I was acting like a landlord instead of a brother. He told me I was being cold. Eric finally spoke up then and said I did not understand what it was like. He said babies needed stability. He said I had no idea what pressure felt like. That part almost made me laugh from how upside down it was. I had been carrying pressure for years. I had been the one with steady work. I had been the one with the mortgage. I had been the one who did not get to quit when life got inconvenient. But I knew better than to say any of that at the table, because once people get emotional, facts become decorative. So I kept my voice even. I said I understood that they were stressed. I said that did not change the answer. I said I was not transferring ownership of my home. My dad's face got harder after that. He said we look out for family. He said that like it settled everything. He said it like it was a law. I looked him in the eye and told him in the calmest voice I could manage that he did not get to demand what he never helped me earn. That changed the room. My mom made a sound like she had been waiting for somebody to say something sharp enough to cut the tension. Eric went red. Megan's eyes dropped even lower. My dad pushed back from the table and said I was being disrespectful. I told him I was being clear. Then I left before the whole thing could turn into one of those endless family shouting matches where nobody remembers what was actually said and everybody remembers being offended. I drove home angry, but also weirdly shaken, not because I doubted my answer, because I doubted my family. I had always known Eric got more help than I did. I just had not realized they were willing to ask me for something that big. That night I barely slept. I kept replaying the look on my dad's face. He did not look confused, he looked certain. That bothered me more than the request itself. People who are testing you usually look guilty. He looked like he already had a story in his head where I was the bad guy. The next morning I got a text from my mom telling me my dad had been upset all night and that Eric was taking it hard because of the baby. I did not respond right away. I wanted to be angry, but I also wanted to be fair. So I offered what I thought was a reasonable compromise. I said I would help them look for a rental. I said I could contribute toward the deposit if they found a place. I said I could even help move furniture. What I would not do was transfer my house. My mom never replied to that message. My dad did 2 hours later with something short and cold about how he hoped I never found myself needing family and getting treated the way I was treating Eric. That line sat in my chest all day. I kept thinking about it at work while I was troubleshooting a broken panel at a warehouse outside town. I kept thinking about it while I was in the hardware store after work, buying a replacement exterior light for my own porch. I kept thinking about it while I was paying my electric bill online. The more I thought about it, the more the whole thing started to feel off in a way I could not quite name yet. It was not just the request. It was how quickly everybody had seemed to assume I would say yes. A few days later, my cousin Dana called me and asked in an uncomfortable voice whether I had really refused to help Eric. She said Eric had told people I was being stubborn about a temporary arrangement. That was the first clue that what happened at dinner had already been retold with details missing. I told Dana that nobody had asked me for a temporary arrangement. I told her they had asked me to sign over the house. She went quiet for a second. Then she said that was not how Eric had described it. I should have stopped there. I should have let the weirdness stay weird. Instead, I started asking questions. That is where the whole thing began to unravel. I asked Dana what Eric had told people. She said Eric told them he and Megan were going to stay with me for a while and that I had promised to let them use the house until they got settled. I just stood there in my kitchen with the phone in my hand, staring at the sink like it might explain what I had just heard. I had never said that, not even close. I asked Dana who had heard this version. She said my dad had repeated it to a couple relatives already and that he seemed sure I would come around once I cooled off. That was the moment I realized they were not just asking. They were building a case, not in a legal sense, at least not yet, in a family sense. They were turning my refusal into a temporary misunderstanding so that my eventual no could be framed as betrayal instead of boundaries. I did not like that. I liked it even less when I started looking more closely at Eric's situation. He had always been vague about money, which I used to think was just him being embarrassed. After that dinner, I stopped giving him the benefit of the doubt. I noticed that every time he talked about the baby, he left out practical details. I noticed that he never mentioned how much rent he owed. I noticed that he never mentioned the lease ending. I noticed that he never said where they would actually go if they got evicted. I started paying attention to the things he said and the things he avoided. Then I started checking paperwork. I pulled my property records from the Franklin County Auditor's website. My name was the only one on the deed. No surprises there, but seeing it in black and white made me feel steadier. I pulled my mortgage account too. Everything was current. No one else had any interest in the property. No one else had ever contributed to it. I had a pretty ordinary mortgage with a local credit union, nothing exotic, and I had been making payments on time for 4 years. That mattered to me more than I expected. It was one thing to know you earned something. It was another to see the paper trail that proved it. I also called the bank and asked a completely hypothetical question about adding someone to a home title. The woman on the phone was polite in that very careful bank way, and she told me that anything like that would require legal paperwork, likely refinancing, and possibly title changes that should be reviewed by an attorney. That was enough for me. I was not about to walk into a situation like this without understanding the consequences. The next day, during lunch, I called a real estate attorney my coworker had used when he bought an investment property. The attorney was a blunt older guy who did not waste time pretending not to know why I was calling. He told me very plainly that giving someone a house without planning for it was a bad idea under almost any circumstance. He explained that if I quitclaimed the property to Eric, I would lose control immediately. He explained that if Eric had debt, a divorce, legal trouble, or anything else going on, the house could get pulled into messes that were not mine. He explained that family pressure was not a legal reason to make a bad financial decision. That part hit hard because it was exactly what I needed to hear from someone who was not emotionally tangled up in my life. I asked him whether there was any way to help Eric without risking my home. He said yes, plenty of ways, but not by giving away the deed. He suggested I keep everything in writing if the family kept pushing. He suggested I not let anyone present a signed paper in a rushed moment. He suggested I be careful about being guilted into anything on the spot. I remember hanging up and feeling both relieved and sad. Relieved because I had confirmation that my instincts were not crazy. Sad because I had to get legal advice just to protect myself from my own family. A week later, Eric called me from my brotherly concern era, which was his version of sounding sincere. He said he wanted to talk in person. He said he had been stressed. He said the baby had made everything feel bigger. I said we could talk. We met at a coffee place near Easton because it was public and neutral, and I knew it would keep things calmer. He looked exhausted when he showed up. His eyes were puffy, his shirt wrinkled, and he kept rubbing the back of his neck. I could tell he had rehearsed something. He started by saying he appreciated that I was trying to help. That was a weird opening because I had not actually helped yet. He then said he and Megan really needed a stable place. He said the apartment was getting bad. He said the landlord had been complaining. He said the rent had gone up. He said the baby needed more room than they had. Nothing about that was technically a lie, but it also was not the whole story. I asked how much rent they were behind. He blinked at me and said they were not behind. That was the first time I knew he was lying. I had not even accused him of anything yet. I just asked a plain question and watched him answer too fast. I asked again, and this time he said it was complicated. Then he admitted they were a little behind, but not enough for it to matter. I asked whether they were facing eviction. He said no. That was another lie. I did not know that yet, but I knew enough to hear the hesitation. I told him I had been looking at my options and that I had spoken to an attorney. His face changed immediately. He asked why I would do that. I told him because he and Dad had asked me to transfer a house and I wanted to understand what that actually meant. He got defensive after that and said I was acting like they were trying to scam me. I told him that if they were not trying to scam me, then he should not have a problem with me understanding the paperwork. He did not have a good answer for that. He said Dad had just been trying to help. He said Dad thought I had enough and Eric did not. That was the core of it, not need, not stability, not the baby. Just the old family logic that whoever had worked hard enough to get ahead was now responsible for bailing out the person who had not. I told him I would not be signing anything. He tried one more angle and said I could at least put him on the deed for now so the baby would have a home in the family. I told him no again. He left before the coffees were even finished. I sat there for a while after he left, staring at a styrofoam lid and feeling embarrassed that I had even let myself think there might be a reasonable version of this story. A few days later, Megan's sister, Tasha, posted pictures from a baby shower at a rented hall in Pickerington. I had not planned on looking at them, but social media has a way of making bad timing easy. I recognized some family members in the pictures, so I clicked through. That was where I saw enough to make me start putting pieces together differently. Tasha had tagged a few people, and one of them commented something about Eric finally getting a bigger place lined up. That comment sat in my head for a while, because it did not sound like someone talking about a temporary stay. It sounded like somebody expecting a move. I called Tasha later that night because I was done being polite about half-truths. I kept it simple. I asked whether Eric and Megan had already found a house. She was hesitant at first, but she was also pregnant and tired and not as invested in family games as the older generation was. She told me that no, they had not found a house. She told me they had been talking about staying with me. She told me Eric had told people I had room and that I was basically waiting to be convinced. Then she said something that changed the whole temperature of the situation. She said she thought everybody knew they were about to get evicted. I just sat there listening to her explain in a careful, awkward way that the landlord had filed paperwork after repeated late payments and that they had already gotten a notice. It was not a full legal eviction, yet when Dad first approached me, it was close enough. Close enough that suddenly the urgency made sense. Close enough that the pressure made sense. Close enough that Eric had been hiding the real reason for the chaos. I thanked Tasha and ended the call, then stood in my kitchen for a long time feeling a mix of anger and disappointment, so sharp it was almost physical. Now the whole thing had shape. They were not asking me to help a pregnant couple because they were struggling. They were trying to find a soft landing before the official trouble landed on them. My house was not about family stability. It was about their emergency. That was when I started keeping records on purpose. Every text, every voicemail, every call log, every message from my parents, Eric, or anybody relaying what they thought I had agreed to. I saved everything. I had not gone into this intending to build a file, but once I saw how quickly the story was being rewritten, I knew I needed facts and timestamps more than I needed emotions. My mom called one evening while I was making dinner. She asked if I had spoken to Eric. I said yes. She asked whether I had maybe been too hard on him. I told her no, I had just been clear. Then she said something that I still think about. She said Dad believed I would understand if I stopped looking at it like ownership and started looking at it like family responsibility. I told her that family responsibility did not mean handing over a mortgage and deed to someone who had not paid them. She did not argue with that. She just got quiet. The silence on her end told me she knew more than she had admitted at dinner. I asked her directly whether Dad had promised Eric the house before talking to me. She hesitated too long. That was enough. She finally said she thought Dad had been talking about what would be best, not making promises. That is the kind of sentence adults use when they want to lie without technically lying. I let it go because I was tired of squeezing truth out of everybody. The next Sunday I was supposed to have lunch at my parents' house again, but I did not want to walk into another ambush. Instead, I invited my mom to come by my place on Saturday afternoon. I figured if we were going to talk honestly, it was better to do it in my own living room where I could see the walls I was being asked to give away. She came alone. That told me something right away. She spent the first few minutes complimenting the house, which she usually did whenever she felt guilty. Then she got down to it. She said Eric was panicking. She said Megan's pregnancy had made him feel like he was failing. She said Dad had gotten fixated on solving the housing problem because he hated seeing his younger son embarrassed. I told her I understood all of that and still was not giving away my house. Then she finally admitted the part she had been dancing around. Eric did not just need a place to live. He needed to avoid being forced into a lease that would involve the collections and bad credit he had hidden from everybody. He had also been using my dad's address for some mail because he did not want notices going to the apartment management office after the landlord started pressing him. That was the detail that made the whole thing click in a deeper way. They were not just worried about the baby. They were worried about paperwork. Paperwork is where a lot of family lies go to die. A baby is emotional, a house is emotional, a legal notice is not. I asked my mom whether Eric had any judgment against him or whether there was something else he had not told us. She gave me a look that said she wished she did not have to answer. Then she said yes, there was debt. A lot of it, credit cards, a personal loan, at least one old medical bill, nothing catastrophic on its own, but enough that he was already in a hole before the baby even arrived. I sat there with that for a minute. That explained why he wanted my house so badly. A house I already owned outright was a massive asset compared to the financial mess he was in. My mom kept trying to soften it. She said he was ashamed. She said he was trying to do better. She said the baby scared him. I believed all of that. I also believed he had lied to me. Both things could be true. I told my mom I would not punish a baby for Eric's stupidity, but I would not rescue him by handing over the roof over my own head. She looked tired after that, not angry, just tired. She asked whether I could maybe let them stay for a little while. I said no, not because I wanted them homeless, because I knew exactly what would happen if they got in the door. Temporary would become indefinite. Ownership would become obligation. Any boundary I set would become the next insult. My mom left without arguing. That was the saddest part of all of this. She did not try to fight me. She just seemed to understand that the family script had finally run into a wall. For a few days things went quiet, which almost made me nervous. Then Eric showed up unannounced on a Thursday evening while I was outside mowing the front lawn. He did not bring Megan. He came by himself and looked like he had not slept. He stood at the edge of my yard with his hands on his hips and asked if we could talk. He did not sound angry. He sounded defeated. That made me lower my guard for about 10 seconds. He said the eviction paperwork had moved forward. He said they were trying to figure out what to do. He said Dad had been talking about maybe co-signing something if needed, but that his credit was rough and nobody wanted to keep getting denied. That was when he tried again, softer this time, to ask if I would let them use the house just until the baby came. I told him no. He asked if I was serious. I said yes. He asked whether I really wanted my niece or nephew born into a bad apartment with no room. That was the first time he used the baby in a way that felt almost cruel. I told him I wanted the baby fine. I wanted him to be honest. I wanted him to stop trying to turn my home into his emergency plan. He got visibly angry then and said I never cared about him. I almost laughed because that had been the family line for years whenever he did not get what he wanted. I told him I had cared enough to help him plenty of times already. I told him I had been willing to help with rent and deposits. I told him I was not going to hand over a house because he kept putting himself in bad spots. He pointed at my driveway and said I would not even miss the place because I could buy another one someday. That was such a ridiculous thing to say that it told me more than any argument could have. People who think your work is interchangeable usually never did the work themselves. I told him the house was not a spare shirt. I told him no again. He stared at me for a long second, and then said I was making a choice that would break the family. I said the family was already breaking itself, and he knew exactly why. That ended the conversation. He walked off before I finished mowing. That weekend, Dad called and told me I needed to be at the house on Sunday because this had gone far enough and we were going to settle it like adults. I almost laughed at the irony. Still, I went. I wanted to hear whatever story he had built for himself. When I got there, Eric and Megan were there too, along with my mom and, to my surprise, my Aunt Carol, who usually stayed out of family drama unless it got truly absurd. That was when I realized this was not an ordinary conversation. It was an intervention for my refusal. My dad had brought backup. He started by saying he was disappointed in me. He said Eric was in a hard season. He said Megan was under stress. He said family had to step in when one member needed a foundation. I asked him if he had explained the part where Eric had lied about already having my agreement. He waved that away and said Eric had been hopeful. I said hopeful was not the same as lying. Then I pulled out my phone and read off a few messages. Nothing dramatic, just enough to show the timeline. I showed the text from Eric where he said he had told people I would come around. I showed the message from my mom where she said Dad believed I would understand if I stopped looking at it like ownership and started looking at it like family responsibility. I showed the call log and the date I contacted the attorney. Then I put the property records on the coffee table. I had printed them because I am apparently the kind of person who prepares for family chaos like a school project. I pointed at my name on the deed. I pointed at the mortgage balance. I pointed at the tax bill. I said this was mine. Nobody had helped me buy it. Nobody had contributed to the down payment. Nobody had paid the mortgage. Nobody had the right to speak, as though it was available for redistribution. My dad looked at the papers and tried one more time to push the family line. He said blood mattered. He said family had to make sacrifices. I asked him why that sacrifice always seemed to come from the person who had been responsible. That hit him harder than I expected, not because it was rude, because it was true. My Aunt Carol, who had been quiet the whole time, asked Eric point-blank whether he had been honest about the eviction and the debt. He could not answer cleanly. He started talking around it. He said things were complicated. He said he had been trying to protect Megan. He said he had not wanted to stress everybody out. My aunt looked at him in a way that made me realize she had probably been suspicious for a while. Then Megan did something I was not expecting. She started crying and admitted that Eric had told her the house was basically handled because my dad said I would do the right thing. That was the first public crack in the story. She said she thought they were moving into my place after all. She said she had already started picking out furniture. She said they had told people the baby would have the extra room. She said she felt stupid now, and honestly, I believed that she did. I do not think she had been the mastermind here. I think she had believed the version Eric sold her because she wanted to believe it. That made me feel a little sorry for her and a lot angrier at him. My dad tried to keep control of the room, but the room was slipping away from him. Facts do that. Once they start stacking up, family mythology gets flimsy. He asked me if I was really prepared to let my brother face eviction while I kept a house with extra rooms. I told him yes, because it was my house, and the answer had already been no several times. I told him I was not abandoning Eric, but I was not rescuing him by destroying my own finances. I told him I would pay toward a temporary rental or help with moving costs if he would be honest and stop pretending the house was an option. Eric exploded then, not because he was physically violent or anything like that, just because he finally lost whatever control he had left. He said I was hoarding stability. He said I had always been the one who got ahead while he got stuck. He said Dad had been right, that I thought I was better than him. That accusation hit me harder than the others because it was the nearest thing to a real feeling he had said all night. I believe he meant it. I also believe it was wrong. I told him I did not think I was better than him. I told him I thought he had made bad choices and then expected everybody else to absorb the consequences. I told him I had spent years trying to help him without becoming his safety net for every disaster. I told him the difference between love and enabling was starting to matter to me. That was the quietest the room had been all day. My dad stared at me like I had become someone else. Maybe I had. Maybe that is what happens when you stop letting your family rewrite your life. The argument did not end with resolution. It ended with everyone exhausted and resentful, and my dad shutting down the conversation by saying he would not discuss it further if I was going to be so rigid. Rigid was his favorite word for boundaries. I left after that, and for the first time I did not feel guilty about leaving. 2 days later, I got a message from a county records notice service I had signed up for years earlier and forgotten about. It was one of those things that alerts you when a property filing hits your name or address. There had been no transfer, obviously, but there had been an attempted inquiry on the record from a title office tied to a document search under Eric's information. That did not mean he had done anything illegal. It meant he had at least been looking into what it would take. That was enough to make my stomach drop. I called the attorney back and explained what I had found. He told me to keep everything and not sign anything under pressure. He also said something that stuck with me. He said family pressure often starts long before the paperwork does. It starts with making the target feel unreasonable for asking questions. That was exactly what had happened. I felt a little sick realizing how close I had come to wondering whether I was overreacting. A week after that, my mom called me while she was driving and sounded upset. She said Eric had finally been served with the eviction notice at the apartment. He had apparently not told Dad the full timeline. He had also not told Megan the same version of the timeline, which was now causing predictable chaos. My mom was worried about where they would stay. I told her I could help them with a deposit on a short-term rental if they found one. She asked whether I could talk to Dad again. I said no. That was the first time I had ever told her no about something that felt emotionally loaded, and I think she understood what it cost me. She did not push after that. For the next month, the family split into camps without anyone admitting they were doing it. My mom stayed mostly neutral. My Aunt Carol thought I was being fair, and my dad was being foolish. A couple cousins had clearly been fed the version where I had promised the house and pulled back at the last second. I knew because one of them tried to guilt me at a barbecue and then stopped once I mentioned the deed and the attorney. That became a pattern. Whenever the story got away from me, I answered with records, not anger, not speeches. Records, that is what finally changed things. My dad made the mistake of repeating his version to too many people. He told different relatives different details depending on who he was talking to. He left out the eviction. He left out the debt. He left out the fact that nobody had asked me if I wanted to hand over my home before he turned it into a family expectation. Eventually, the people around him started comparing notes. They found the gaps. The timeline stopped making sense in his favor. I did not have to fight him directly anymore because the story started falling apart on its own. The biggest moment came at my grandmother's birthday dinner 2 months later. She was turning 80, and nobody wanted to ruin that, so everyone was trying to behave. I almost did not go, but my mom asked me to because Grandma loved having the whole family together. I figured I could survive one evening. For the first hour, it was almost normal. People ate cake. Kids ran around the yard. Someone brought potato salad from Kroger. People laughed at old photos on somebody's phone. Then Eric showed up late with Megan and the baby supply bag they were using like a prop for their suffering. The atmosphere changed immediately. My dad, who had clearly still been simmering for weeks, made some comment to my uncle about family taking care of family when times got hard. That was the trigger. My Aunt Carol asked, in a way that was gentle but direct, whether that meant he had stopped pressuring me about my house. There was a pause long enough that everybody at the table noticed it. My dad started to answer one way, and then another relative asked whether it was true Eric had been under eviction notice when the whole thing started. Suddenly, all the quiet side conversations became one conversation. I hated that it was happening at Grandma's birthday. I hated even more that it was the first time some of them were hearing the real version. Eric tried to control the narrative again, but he had too many contradictions behind him now. My aunt asked if he had already told people the house was available before he ever got my answer. He did not deny it cleanly. Megan looked miserable. My dad looked cornered. That is when I decided not to let them keep making me the problem. I calmly told the whole table that I had never agreed to sign over the house, never agreed to move out, never agreed to let them treat my mortgage like a family asset, and never received an honest explanation before the pressure started. I did not raise my voice. I did not dramatize it. I just told the truth in the plainest language possible. Then I said I had paperwork for everything if anybody wanted to see it. That line ended the guessing. Nobody actually wanted to see the paperwork, because once the truth is obvious, people prefer not to hold it. My dad looked like he wanted to say something sharp, but my grandmother started crying, not because she was upset with me, but because she was tired of the family always fighting around major life events. That shut everybody up. The rest of the evening was strained and ugly in a quiet way. My dad barely spoke to me. Eric barely looked at me. Megan sat there staring at the baby stuff like she wanted to disappear. But the important thing was that the room had shifted. They were no longer arguing from authority. They were defending themselves. That is a much weaker position. After that dinner, people started being more careful around me, not because I had become intimidating, because they had learned I kept records. Dad called twice in the following weeks, but the calls were shorter and less certain. First time he said he wanted to move on. The second time he said he hoped I understood he had only been trying to keep Eric from falling apart. I told him I understood that. I also told him trying to save Eric by sacrificing me had been a terrible plan. He did not like that, but he did not argue. Eric and Megan eventually moved into a short-term rental on the other side of town after my mom and aunt helped them with the application and deposit. I did not pay for all of it, though I did help with part of the moving truck because I wanted the kid to be born somewhere stable. That did not make anybody happy because the family liked absolutes and I was refusing to give them one. I think that bothered them almost as much as the house issue. They wanted me either fully cruel or fully compliant. I was neither. Eric never apologized in the dramatic way people expect in stories. He sent me a text a couple months later saying he had been under a lot of pressure and had not handled it well. That was probably the closest he could get. I replied that I was glad they had a place and hoped the baby arrived healthy. I meant it. I did not need him to be ruined to feel vindicated. The baby was born in early spring. My mom sent a photo. I sent back a small gift card for diapers and did not mention the house. My dad and I stayed awkward for a while. We were not openly hostile anymore, but something had broken. He would still call about routine things. Car trouble, weather, a leaky gutter at my parents' place. But the easy trust was gone. I do not think he ever fully understood that what he had done was not just asking for help. It was assuming ownership over the consequences of my life because it was convenient for him. That sort of thing is hard for people to admit, especially fathers who think providing means controlling. The upside was that I got a strange kind of peace out of all of it. My house stopped feeling like a symbol and started feeling like a home again. I fixed the fence. I replaced the old bathroom vanity. I painted the spare room and made it into a small office instead of leaving it half ready for someone else's future. I started sleeping better because I no longer felt like I was waiting for another family emergency to swallow my weekends. I also did something I should have done years earlier. I updated my will. I put the house into a simple trust so nobody could ever again talk themselves into thinking vague family pressure was enough to override what I had built. That part felt almost boring when I did it, which is probably why it was so satisfying. No drama, no shouting, just paperwork done correctly. A few months after the baby was born, my Aunt Carol told me something that made the whole mess make a little more sense. She said my dad had always been most anxious when one of us did better than expected. Not because he was jealous exactly, more because success changed the family balance and he liked balance he could manage. Eric needed rescuing, I needed steering. That was how he saw it. Hearing that stung because it explained so much without excusing any of it. I had spent years thinking the unfairness was random. It was not random, it was a pattern. Once I saw the pattern, I stopped taking it personally. That was probably the biggest change of all. I still love my family. That never changed. But love without boundaries just turns into a permission slip for other people's panic. I learned that the hard way. If I had screamed at my dad, they would have gotten to call me emotional. If I had caved, I would have spent years regretting it. Instead, I stayed calm, got the facts, checked the records, talked to an attorney, and let the truth do the work. That was the part that really bothered them, not that I said no. That I said no with paperwork. Even now, when I walk through the house in the evening and hear the floorboards settle, I think about how close I came to letting guilt turn into a deed transfer. I think about how my dad could look me in the eye and ask for something he had never earned. I think about how sure he was that family pressure would eventually beat preparation. It did not. The strongest position I was ever in was not when I was angry. It was when I was calm enough to keep proof. That is what saved my house. And honestly, it saved my relationship with my own head too. Because once the dust settled, I could finally see the whole thing clearly. I had not refused to help family. I had refused to be erased by it. and after everything that happened, I am more than fine with that.